Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here. I'm just sitting here drinking my morning coffee. Got a hook grip on the cup. See, I didn't fake sip for you guys. Some people catch me on that when I do the fake sip just to troll people. Alright guys, today I want to talk with you guys a little bit about EMG studies, because this is one of the problems we run into, is that there is some problems with using EMG studies to determine muscle growth. And I'm not saying that the research isn't interesting. I'm not saying I don't use it, because I do. I look at a lot of the EMG stuff because I find it interesting, and I look at it and say, okay, maybe some of this is useful for, maybe you've got a weak point, whether it's from a performance perspective or an aesthetic perspective or something else. You've got a weak point, a muscle somewhere that you might want to work on, give it some extra work. Maybe the EMG studies are useful for that. Or they're useful for finding maybe overall trends in movement patterns, right? They're useful for that stuff. But the problem we run into is when we make the assumption that because something does better on an EMG study that it's going to translate into more muscle growth. You see the problem there? That's a hypothetical. That's a hypothetical. And I want to get into why that is for a couple of reasons, but even the very concept itself, I've seen researchers and other people, I've seen researchers like Greg Nuckols and others kind of try to even understand this concept. And this is, so again, people say, well, why could that be? I don't know that I can answer that. When you have experts with advanced degrees who are struggling to find answers to something, it's not going to be easy for you and I, and it's definitely not going to be useful for the layman or a high school student listening or anyone else to understand what's going on, because when the experts don't even get it, that's a problem. But what's been noted is that muscle activation, the amount of muscle activation performed on an exercise, isn't always indicative of hypertrophy. Not always indicative of hypertrophy. Meaning, when we actually go study hypertrophy in a lab and you have people do exercises and you measure muscle growth over time, their activation on an EMG isn't necessarily correlated with the amount of muscle they gain. And a classic example, we could go look at studies on bicep curls versus lat pull downs, right? That's a perfect example. When we study it in a lab, even with people of different experience level, we don't find that bicep curls produce more muscle growth than a lat pull down does. And I'm talking a pronated grip lat pull down when tracked for 8 or 10 weeks. If you have someone just do one versus the other, the lat pull downs cause just as much muscle growth. And it's not just in ranked novices. This stuff's been looked at in other people. But if we look at an EMG, every sort of bicep curl causes more activation than the lat pull down. And when we look at the line of pull involved, it makes sense that it should, right? Makes sense. Why wouldn't it cause more muscle activation? Of course it does. Now you usually ought to look at the line of pulls involved. Obviously the biceps will be doing more technical work on a curl. Yet when we measure the muscle growth, the lat pull down causes just as much muscle growth in the bicep. And it's counterintuitive because it shouldn't, but it does. So the question we would ask is, well, what's going on here? What is happening? And I would like to throw a couple things out there. First of all, when we look at EMG studies are imperfect. EMG studies are looking usually at a single rep or a double rep. Some cases they'll look at 3 reps and they'll find the best rep out of there, and that's what they'll take. But again, we're usually looking at a very, very limited body of evidence. When we start dealing with compound movements, though, what happens? Because what's interesting is, like, let's say you take some of, what's his name? The glute guy. Brett Contreras did a bunch of EMG studies, and I think they're interesting. He's got 3 big ones that we can easily find where he compared sometimes up to 20 plus exercises, sometimes more, for given muscles to see what happened. But when you start looking at some of them, sometimes a simple change of weight on the bar, sometimes a simple change of weight on the bar impacts these studies enormously. And when we start looking at them, sometimes they're different exercises and the same weight will be used, like an incline bench versus a flat bench or certain types of rows, the same weight's used, when you should probably be doing at least 10% more on a different one. But what's interesting is that sometimes when you look at the data there and you look at 3 different muscles being activated, when the weight changes, sometimes 185 pounds versus 220, you'll see obviously 2 of the muscle groups you'll get more activation with the heavier weight, but then you go look at some of the slightly more secondary muscles and what happens. Sometimes they score 1% higher with the lighter weight, even though a lot of the primary movers don't. Like certain parts of the trapezius, for example, on a row, right? We'll see that stuff and go, well, wait a minute, that's different. Why did we get a hair more muscle activation with a lighter weight on the same exercise for a single rep? And what starts happening when we extrapolate this down over multiple reps? Like let's say you do 3 sets of 5. That's more of a traditional novice protocol. What happens when we get to that 3rd set on a big compound movement? Does the muscle load shift? What happens when some of the primary movers are getting more fatigued? Do some of the more secondary movers start to have to handle a larger and larger brunt of the load? Do they come into play more the further we get into the work? And what happens with even the primary movers as volume goes up? Are they still getting sufficient workload? I would suggest yes, because when you look at the data, again, why do we have bench press producing as much tricep development as press downs and things and tricep extensions that score higher on the EMG on the triceps? They do. They cause just as much growth. The lat pull down causing just as much in the bicep. It could simply be to just the accumulation of work and fatigue in the muscles. Just the sheer volume of it ends up balancing it all out in the end. Or you don't necessarily need optimal activation of a muscle to make it grow, as long as you make it do enough work to get that certain fatigue and there's progressive overload there, it's probably going to grow anyways. And maybe the difference is when we start getting up there, maybe it is still getting more activation, but the differences are so small at a certain threshold that it's no longer causing an amount of muscle growth that's different that we can measure in the short term. Meaning a muscle might be growing so little difference between the two in, say, a 10-week block that we can't even measure it on a DEXA scan or an MRI. It might have grown more, but the measurement is too small for us to take with our equipment, because it's a relatively insignificant amount. And maybe over the course of 5 years, you might gain a little hair more muscle with the other exercise, maybe, but it's so small that we can't measure it in a shorter time frame. Then we get into the issue of the measurements itself. I mean, he's not a doctor. Let's sip my coffee here, I'm out of weight. Lyle McDonald's criticism of a lot of that research is the EMGs aren't particularly accurate in his opinion anyways, and he's got an undergrad in exercise science. He says because the way you're doing them, you're just sticking electrodes on there. You're not getting an accurate measurement of everything going on in the muscle. You might have 1 or 2 electrodes on one part of a head. You're reading that surface reading there, but you don't know what's going on 2 inches further into that muscle somewhere else. The electrodes aren't fully reading that as effectively. You probably need to put about 10 needles deep inside the muscle intramuscularly to get a more accurate measurement, which would be unethical, painful, could damage the person. Not really an ideal way to measure. So your other problem with EMG studies is the potential for accuracy isn't fully there. You are still drawing limited data with that EMG study that you're looking at. So there's the problems there also. But it's not to say they're not interesting. I mean, we can draw interesting trends from them, just like we know that the faster you accelerate a weight, the more muscle activation we get. That it matters more than mind-muscle connection, but the mind-muscle connection seems to get a little more activation. Now, that's well and good, because usually, I mean, our goal should be to get muscle activation. I mean, if you want a muscle to grow, doing things to get more muscle activation is probably a good thing. Probably a good thing. We could argue that. And it's a reasonable hypothesis. But when we do look at the actual data out there on muscle growth, it doesn't seem to matter to the extent that we think it does. I mean, because if we went based upon the data we have on muscle activation, people who do slow reps shouldn't be gaining crap for muscle ever. They still gain muscle. But if we went purely on muscle activation, we know that slow reps do not cause as much muscle activation. We know that. Guys are still growing doing them. Probably not ideal. And again, we could argue based on the EMG. But we could also argue that there are certain muscles it's not ideal to train the way that people do, yet they get those results. I mean, take something like the middle head of the delt. there are exercises that don't hit it particularly well on EMGs, and we look at it, they shouldn't, that still produce pretty good muscle growth. They produce pretty good muscle growth. And we start looking at stuff like band face pulls. If we were to look at just EMG data, we would just conclude that band face pulls are all we ever need to do for our side and rear delts, because they just light it up. And maybe they are amazing growth stimulators, but face pulls with bands light up the side delts as well as a lateral raise does. They light up the rear head of the delt more than a lot of delt flies do. They hit the traps pretty good. And we know they're a good prehab exercise for rotator cuffs. I mean, if we go off EMG, that would be a fantastic exercise that we should all be doing all the time. And they're a good exercise, and I like band face pulls. But again, you look at the EMG data, and it makes certain exercises look just downright amazing when you've got a question, are they really? And the same thing, we look at a lot of this stuff for the medial head of the delt, yet there are coaches out there who say, you know what, I don't think you need any medial delt work, because you look at rows, actually rows produce decent results in that area, just barbell rows, right, on the EMG. But we're talking data that looks similar to the lat pull down on the bicep. Yet there are coaches who say you don't need any side delt work. I have people do nothing but get really strong on the bench in the rows, and their delts fully develop. There are cases of that, and there are coaches who preach that. I'm not saying I would preach that. I'm not saying that I would take all that work out for those, because again, I'm reluctant just based upon muscle activation and biomechanics. But there are coaches doing it successfully, and their guys have pretty well developed delts. So you see this stuff out there happening. So again, we get into the question with EMGs. I like EMG data. It's interesting. I mean, it can tell us certain things and trends, but is it the be-all, end-all? I don't know that it is. And some of it runs counterintuitive. We start looking at things like chin-ups, right? And we start looking at stuff in the bicep, and we find that even the hammer strength grip, this pronated grip chin-up, actually produces amazing EMG data, particularly once you start doing them weighted, full range of motion weighted. They light up the bicep on the EMG, more so than even an underhand grip, that hammer grip position. But then we look at a hammer curl, and it doesn't do nearly as well. It's just interesting when you look at some of the data and wonder why they light up that way. I don't know, but then again, if we look at all the data on everything else, it probably really is a good bicep builder. So here's my thing with EMG data. I think it's nice to look at. I think it can be a useful tool for finding certain trends. But I think we can also overanalyze it. We can accept it too much as gospel that, whatever is showing best on various EMG studies must be the best for muscle growth. Whereas in the reality is, it just doesn't seem to be true when we start studying muscle growth in real life people over time. A lot of this stuff that we draw short-term studies or limited data from, everything from, anabolic metabolites after training a certain way up to EMG data, just doesn't seem to make the difference that we hope it will when it comes to actual muscle growth. And at the end of the day, muscle growth is purely just a product of workload, hard work, and progressive overload. That really seems to be what matters. And we can overanalyze this stuff sometimes to the point to where, again, you can get paralysis by analysis if you're not careful. Use it for what it is. It's a useful set of guidelines and tools, maybe particularly useful if you've got a lagging muscle group somewhere. But outside of that, it's just interesting. It's not, we shouldn't take it as gospel. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.